Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we're going to be reviewing or giving a summary of a recent debate on the cosmological argument. This was a debate between Andrew Locke, who's a professor of philosophy and religion at Hong Kong Baptist University, which is actually happens to be just down the road from my house, and Graham Oppy, probably the most prominent atheist thinker of our current generation. So it's a great joy to listen to that debate. If you haven't watched the debate's on Capturing Christianity, and it's really good, so go check it out. Let's be honest here, if you're here, you've probably heard of Capturing Christianity before, but if you haven't, make sure you go check out our brother in Christ, Cameron. It's a great channel, provides a lot of inspiring and thought-provoking details, so make sure you go check that out and subscribe to there. Also, before we get into the video, this is the first video that we've made after 100 subscribers. Yay! It means a lot to me, okay? I want to thank you guys so much for subscribing and supporting me. It's meant a lot to me, and it's good to see that some of you enjoy the content. So if you haven't subscribed, I hope that by the end of this video I would have given you a reason to subscribe to this channel, and I hope that this video would be insightful and informative. So instead of going over the summary in like a chronological order of how the debate kind of went, I would instead go over the individual premises of Locke's argument and then discuss how both parties discussed each of these premises after the premises. So I'll follow the argument in a stepwise or premise-wise formula instead of just how the discussion progressed, because it turns out, well, and it's not surprising that in a discussion-like format that Cameron was using, that they kind of jumped around to the most important ones first before moving on to some lesser important premises. So the order that they discussed it didn't necessarily follow the premises that Locke provided. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So premise one of the argument is essentially the idea that there exists a series of causes and effects and changes. And it's essentially a restatement of a causal principle, the idea that there is a series of causal events. And in response to this, Oppy doesn't respond or doesn't provide a significant rebuttal to it. He happily accepts the causal chain for the sake of the debate. And at this point, I think it's very clear to let you know that a lot of the times in these discussions, especially since there's a time limit, a lot of the times the parties are willing to accept less controversial premises, to really zoom in or spend more time on the more controversial premises. So when I say that Oppy happily accepts it, it doesn't mean he completely agrees with it, but he's happy to grant that premise just for the sake of simplicity and the sake of the argument. The premise one of the argument is not really heavily discussed too much. Premise two of the argument is essentially the start of Locke's disjunctive syllogism, which is essentially a deductive format of argument, which provides three different alternatives, or two different alternatives, from which Locke then says two of these alternatives out of the three in this instance are wrong, and therefore the third instance is correct. So the first premise, or premise two of his argument of this disjunctive syllogism, is that this series of causes and effects either has an infinite regress that avoids the first cause, or its members are joined together in a closed loop that avoids the first cause, or the series has a first cause. So here are three mutually exclusive alternatives, and there are no other alternatives to these three possibilities if premise one is granted. So from which it follows that Locke now has to show that two of these three propositions are wrong. And that's what he does in his premise three of the argument. He says, it is not the case that the series has an infinite regress that avoids a first cause. This is an argument against infinite regress that we find so common in normal Kalam arguments. So essentially he says that there's five main arguments against the infinite regress. First one is being the argument from the impossibility of concrete actual infinities, like Hilbert's Hotel, which I'm sure you've all heard of, the idea that, well, imagine an infinite room or infinite hotel filled with infinite rooms. If one guest arrives to that infinite room, can't you just move everyone up a room and then just add one, and then it leads to a kind of entire paradoxical situation where it's like infinity plus 1 equals infinity, and infinity times 2 also equals infinity. And obviously there's this massive realm of abstract numbers. And on this discussion of the actual infinity, I'm going to be doing a TED Talk really soon on the infinity and why it's impossible. So make sure you stick around, hit the bell notification on this channel if you're interested in that, and I'll let you know when I do that and when it's uploaded. So that out of the way, let's continue on. His second argument that he raises is an argument from the impossibility of transversing an actual infinite, which basically kind of says that you can't have an actual infinite and you plus one and then you continue either adding up to infinity or subtracting from infinity. Like, the numbers and arithmetic regarding that is very absurd, or just leads to mind-boggling results. Then there's the argument from the viciousness of dependence regress, the argument from the Grim Reaper's paradox, and the argument from Methuselah's diary paradox. To which Andrew notes that all 5 of these arguments don't all have to be defended per se, only one of them has to be right to demonstrate the falsity of an infinite regress. And in response to that, I'm actually quite surprised that they don't argue over this point too much. However, and in fact, Graham Oppy seems to agree that the infinite regress is highly more improbable. And as you can see, this is a different type of discussion or different type of strength of the argument. While Locke is arguing that infinite regress is impossible, Oppy just says it's more probable that there is no infinite regress. And he further says that it is not irrational to hold an infinite regress. Because, well, if you accept the axioms of infinite set theory, it does appear that the conclusion or the nature of the actual infinite set does seem to work to some extent. But I wouldn't talk more about this in this video because they didn't discuss it too much here, and I don't think we need to go in depth here because Oppy was kind of willing to accept the idea that the universe had a beginning, or the past was not infinite for the sake of simplicity. So since we've established, or we've seen that the first premise or the first proposition of this destructive syllogism is wrong, Locke then rightfully turns to the second one. He says it is not the case that members are joined together like a closed loop. This is the idea that since Locke believes that causes are transitive, which is the idea that A cause B, and if B cause C, then A cause C, because the relationship transfers, and that's like how I like to present it, a transitive relationship, is that the cause relationship transfers from A to B and then to C. With this in mind, if there is a causal loop, then, and given that causation is transitive, then if A caused B and B caused C and C caused D, and since there's a loop, D caused A again, then what do we have here? We have A causing A, which is viciously circular. In response to this, Oppy is willing to accept this argument as well. However, he does note that the main problem of this argument lies in the fact whether causation is transitive or not, and that's a key proponent or the key part of this argument which has to be debated over, because some people could deny that causes are transitive in the sense that although A caused B and B caused C, it doesn't follow that A caused C. And from that, it does suggest that to at least some people, causes are not transitive, but since they don't discuss this too much, and Oppy does agree that if it's true that it's transitive and something causes itself, that is impossible because causes have to have effects before them, and causes cannot cause themselves because that's an analytic proposition. Like, causes need effects and causes can't cause themselves. Since this is a destructive syllogism, the conclusion necessarily follows. If it's not the first or the second proposition, it follows that it has to be the third proposition. This is the idea that the series has a first cause. So, in response to this, Oppy doesn't argue over it too much, but raises the fundamental or the constant or the always used response or the suggestion that, well, why can't there be multiple first causes? And in response to this, Locke raises 3 criticisms or responses. He says, first, Occam's razor. This is the idea that the more simple explanation is normally the right one. He says Occam's razor seems to point towards one cause of the universe instead of multiplying these causes beyond necessity. Like, why say there's a million causes when you could only say there's one? And that's his first response. His second response is that let's talk about the consideration of the universal applicability of the laws of physics. This is the idea that all the laws of physics seems to be universal throughout the universe. You go to Pluto, you go to Mars, you go to Alpha Centauri, you go to the other edge of the universe. The physical laws seem to be universal. which seems to just suggest that there's one creator of the universe. Locke implying that if there were multiple creators of the universe, it is possible that different sectors of the universe would have different laws of nature, and hence gravity under one creator might be like, oh, I'm the creator of this section, let me tweak gravity a bit, and then the creator of another section says I'll tweak gravity or entropy another bit, and then everything goes into a bit of a mess. But this is not what we see, so Locke then suggests that this change implies that there's no multiple causes of the universe. Finally, Locke argues that special revelation and miracles seem to point towards a monotheistic cause. This is a reference to like the resurrection hypothesis and perhaps other monotheistic faiths, where the divine revelation given by God to humans is via the form of a monotheistic relationship. However, in response to this, one can probably suggest that, well, perhaps there are polytheistic revelation, like what about the Greeks, the revelation that the Greeks had, the Nordic people had? Why not about Zeus and Hercules and Poseidon or Thor and stuff like that? And though that might change this argument or weaken it a bit, it does suggest, or we do have to take into account miracles by their context, which means that when we look at a miracle, we can't say that it's right or wrong, like just by looking at the miracle. We have to look at its context and its supporting data. And from this perspective, I think Locke is quite right. The evidence or the reason to believe in the miracle of the resurrection is perhaps stronger or greater than the evidence required or the evidence to believe in Zeus or Hercules or someone like that. So it does seem to point that to some degree Locke's argument, his third rebuttal, is correct. And Oppy doesn't argue too much about it, so we can move on to the fifth premise. Since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused. That's an analytic proposition, and there is no debate over this. However, premise 6 is where it gets really interesting. This is the causal principle. Since whatever begins to exist have a cause, the first cause must be beginningless. And what's very interesting here is that I think that Oppy is not really arguing against the causal principle per se. Instead, he's arguing that the applicability of the causal principle that Locke uses is wrong, because what Locke tries to do is establish the causal principle using modus tollens. He basically raises an argument which can be summarized as follows. If the universe began to exist without a cause, other things would come into being without a cause. Premise 2, common experience falsifies the idea that there are a multitude of universes. Conclusion 1, it is not the case that universes begin to exist without a cause. So, with this in mind, it does seem that it is deductively valid, which means that if the premises are true or sound, the conclusion must follow. So are these premises true? And this is where the discussion gets really heated. It's not over the causal principle per se, but it's more targeted toward Locke's individual premises. In defense of premise 1, Locke basically says there is no cause which determines why this universe exists and why many other universes don't exist. Because he argues in support of this is that there are no differences between all universes when they're coming out of nothing. And this is the entire confusion which underlied the debate between Locke and Oppy. They kind of talk past each other for quite a long while here. So in order to kind of clear up this explanation, let me try to elucidate or present what Locke is trying to say a bit more. So essentially what Locke is trying to say here is that let's take into account a state of nothingness, because we've established there's a state of affairs, not a time, but a state of affairs where the universe doesn't exist. So when we have this state of nothingness, let's imagine nothingness here, right? And then universe is coming into being out of nothing. Since Locke believes, and William Lane Craig also presents this in his discussion with Cosmic Skeptic on Cosmic Skeptic channel, the link's going to be in the description below for that as well. Essentially, he's arguing that properties are properties of things and not properties of non-things. In that way, when things immediately come out of nothing, a priori, without further understanding about the thing itself, all things which come out of nothing before they exist have the similar probability of something which comes out of nothing, and in that sense they're all similar, even if they might lead to various different events, perhaps possible world A, possible world B, possible world C. Before they come into world existence, they're just possible worlds. They are without properties, since they haven't existed yet. they technically cannot be different. They can't be differentiated. That's what Locke's saying. So if one thing could come into being out of nothing, why can't another thing come into being without something? And that's basically what Locke is trying to get here. And in response to this, Oppy is saying, well, the universe, its initial state, is necessary. And since it is necessary, other things cannot come into being without a cause. In response to this, what Locke is trying to say is that the initial state, this universe, cannot be necessary because what differentiates between properties could only be come into existence after it comes into being. So what Locke is trying to say is, well, let's imagine there's nothing here, right? And then my pencil appears. Imagine this pencil is necessary. Or even if we follow, I think not really that wording, but I think what Locke is trying to say is that following Oppy's interpretation of the facts, the idea that the universe is necessary, he essentially says, well, maybe this pen is necessary. If Oppy says maybe this pen is necessary, we still know that since from the previous argument that there is a first cause, there was a state of affairs where nothing existed, right? There's nothing in my hands right now. And then miraculously out of my hands, a pen appears like this. And the pen is necessary, right? Well, even if the pen is necessary, it will only be necessary after the universe began to exist, but not necessary before it began to exist. And then that's basically because if it was necessary before it exists, then the property of being necessary would be a property of nothingness instead of the property of the pen, which would then seem to defeat Oppy's argument. In response to this, and I think this is where Oppy and Locke start talking past each other a bit, Oppy then says, well, the necessity excludes alternatives. So let's use an analogy. Let's use this pencil analogy again. So what Oppy is trying to say here is that there is pencil A, right? And then there's pencil B. Pencil A is necessary, so by being necessary, it excludes all probability or possibilities of pencil B existing. So this pen could go out of the window. And it's necessarily only this pencil, so the idea that there would be other universes are wrong. And then, to which Locke then responds is that necessary existence can only talk about the property of this pen and not the other one. Because according to Locke, remember, let's think about his worldview again, or his hypothesis. Before both of these pens coming into existence, they both have no properties. The possibility of them both coming out of existence out of nothing are exactly the same. And since they could only have the property of necessity after they came into being, there's no reason why there can't be two things coming into being at the same time and both having the necessary property after they come into being out of nothing. Which seems, if Locke's hypothesis is plausible, does seem to work quite strongly. Because since properties are properties of things and non-things, there should be no difference, assuming that there actually is a state where there are no pens existing. The probability of both of these pens coming into existence out of nothing should be the same. And since they could only have the property of necessity after they come into being, if Oppy is also correct that necessity excludes other alternatives, then it seems via modus tollens that they can't be necessary, because you could write it as if beings are necessary, it excludes other things. Premise 2, there are other things, the other pen. In conclusion, the pens cannot be necessary. And I guess in response here, Oppy would have to say, or a proponent of, or a critic of Locke's idea would just have to say the pen necessarily came out of nothing, which I think is quite weird, because then he'll be seen to be attributing necessity to both the pen and the nothingness, which seems quite strange. So they kind of continue talking past each other for a bit regarding this necessary and special property. But I think this brief understanding, or this brief summary of both of their worldviews or their ideas is sufficient, I think, for now. So let's turn to the second premise of the argument, that common experience falsifies the idea that there are a multitude of universes. So if you've been distracted or you've not remembered the first premise of the modus tollens argument, the first premise of the argument is essentially, if the universe begins to exist without a cause, other things would come into being without a cause. So essentially, since modus tollens is, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, Andrew Locke is trying to say is that, well, it's not the latter proposition, it's not other things would come into being without a cause. And essentially he says, in support of the idea that there are not other universes, common experience falsifies the existence between universes, because if there were multiple universes, like they should crash into each other, and we'll see, according to Locke, disruptions in the CMBR and different phenomenon in the universe, and perhaps we cannot maintain the first law of thermodynamics idea that the universe is somewhat of a closed system. And I don't want to comment too much about the science because I genuinely don't know too much about it, but I'd like to give some observations about this premise, although they didn't discuss it too much in their debate too much. I think there's a few notable objections to this premise, and I'll try to offer some solutions as well. Since this is a deductive argument, and it's all based on the idea that we cannot experience other universes if they exist, one could perhaps suggest that there's a hypothesis where there's nothingness, right? And pen A, or universe A, comes into being here, and pen B comes into being here. And they're so far apart in this state of nothingness that no matter how far they expand, they don't reach each other yet, or they just haven't reached each other yet, and hence we need to see that there's no collision. And that might disprove, or at least suggest a counter or another possibility, that there actually are these other multiverses, but they just haven't crashed yet. But in response to that, I think Locke can reasonably say that, well, since everything is nothingness, technically there is nothing or no space between pen A and pen B coming into existence. So instead of being created really far apart from each other, they should be created right next to each other, because the space in between them would technically be nothing, or analytically be nothing. And I'm not really sure how that works, because I'm not even sure if space could exist in nothingness, but they'll be right next to each other. But then that raises a new problem, doesn't it? Because if they're created right next to each other, we shouldn't see any clashing at all, because if all things were created right next to each other, that means that perhaps books might be easier to represent this than pens. But imagine if I get like these few books here, right? I have some books, well, the Infinity Just, yeah, and Lord of the Rings. Imagine if these all things come into existence very far apart from each other, right? They might crash, and then you'll see collision when they crash together. But, on the other hand, if they're created right next to each other, what happens is not that they will crash, but instead, since the beginning of time when they were all created, they'll just merge together, because they're not expanding into each other and there's a collision, they're just being created infinitesimally close to each other. Perhaps a way to illustrate it would be copy and pasting, you know, you copy and paste one document into another document and then it merges into the other document. And then there's not really any clash in between them or crash in between them, it's just a mergence of the two. So I think that perhaps Locke might need to develop this argument a bit more, though I have to admit I haven't read too much about Locke's work yet, so perhaps he has raised a response to that as well, and I just haven't heard of it, and that's my bad. I haven't done too much research about Locke's work. But let's assume we grant this because Oppy doesn't object it too much, from which it concludes that it is not the case that universes began to exist without a cause, and that just follows from the modus tollens argument, so I wouldn't discuss it too much. However, what does get discussed quite a lot is premise 6 of the argument basically says, since whatever begins to exist has a cause, the causal principle, the first cause must be beginningless, to which Graham Oppy argues that the beginningless principle is a way in which Locke just brings in the properties of God. There's other ways that someone could go around the beginnings principle, like the principle of sufficient reason. And what Oppy is trying to say here is that, let's imagine the universe begins at t0, state to affair t0. He argues that instead of there being a cause for the universe being beginningless, there's an explanation for the beginningless of the universe. And you might say, well, what's the difference here? What's the difference between an explanation and a cause? Well, perhaps a good reason would be this. Well, or explanation would be this. It's like, well, although there are definitely times where cause and explanations are the same thing, it's perhaps like, well, why is this pen, what caused this pen? It's a factory. Perhaps, and the explanation of this pen is also because it's a factory. The explanation is perhaps a more encompassing idea than causing, because cause for this thing is a factory, right? But the explanation for this is that someone needs a pen, and there's all these other ideas that could be added to the explanation, and hence I think Oppy is trying to get at this difference. The explanation he gives for the universe being beginningless, not beginningless, but the explanation he gives for the universe being causeless is that it's necessary, that the necessity is the explanation for the beginningless of the universe. And then he argues that, well, the necessity of God and the necessity of the universe are similar. This is kind of an argument raised by Hume and Russell, and just say, why is it the universe necessary, or why Like, why should God be necessary? Why can't we just accept the universe be necessary as well? To which I think Locke gives a very important response, which is basically saying that, well, there's no reason for us to believe that the universe is necessary. Although, and to build on this, and I don't think Locke develops it too much in his discussion, but let's think about it for a moment. I think this is very important, because when we claim that God is necessary, we're not giving an ad hoc explanation, well, God must be necessary because we need a necessary, like, explanation for the universe. Instead, we're going from, well, there must be a first cause, hence this first cause, in order to be the first cause, it must be necessary. And let's think about this for a moment. We don't get there by just saying, well, let's just throw necessity anywhere just to solve this first cause. We argue from the possibility of both infinite and finite series of causation, and then we reach finite series of causation. And we say, well, we reach the first cause, which analytically must be uncaused. From which it follows, why is this cause uncaused? Well, it's because of its necessity. And here the atheist would say, well, the universe is necessary, or the theist would say God is necessary. But why can't the universe be necessary? It's because when you look at the theist claiming God is necessary, or the first cause is necessary, and the atheist claiming the universe is necessary, I think what both sides agree on is that if the universe is not necessary, there must be a necessary cause of it. And since the theist says, well, the universe is not necessary, there must be a first cause to it. And the atheists agree with that as well, I think. And I think Oppy might agree with that as well. He just says, well, the universe is necessary, and we just have to find reason for believing why the universe is necessary, otherwise it just sounds ad hoc. Because if we look at scientific evidence right now, there seems to be no reasoning why the universe or the mathematical laws seem to be necessary. Oppy then does is that they kind of move on then. They don't really discuss about the universe being necessary and the God being necessary. Instead, Oppy kind of argues that, well, why does God not be subject to the infinite regress problem? To which Locke then responds that two things. First, God is timeless, which is essentially the idea that Cray codes, and that something which is changeless is not going under change, and hence there's no points or states of affairs of change. So it's just one existent state of affairs where God just exists prior or sans the universe. And since God is changeless and unbound by dimensions because he's transcendent, he exists beyond the temporal duration or dimension, and there is no infinite regress here. To which Graham seems to suggest that, well, two things. First of all, it seems that the initial or the first cause seems to imply an order, that there's an initial and a secondary or a posterior cause, and that implies an order or progression here. And also, Graham seems to also suggest that we do not need a metric to support befores and afters, in the sense that God would be before and after even if there's no time. To which Locke, surprisingly, but I do think makes sense, agrees to it in saying that, well, there could be causal priors and causal posteriors, in the sense that God could be the cause of the universe while not technically being temporally before the universe and stuff like that. And this is what Locke's trying to get into here. He's not saying that there's a temporal order in regards to God, but there's a causal order, of which you could draw causal states of affairs, in the sense that God caused the universe, God being a changeless state of affairs, upon which he then causes the universe. And that's a different causal order. And to which Oppy then replies that this causal order is essentially an infinite order, like perhaps God's himself can be divided into multiple points, in which, in that causal order of timelessness of God, there is an infinite regress. To which Locke then replies that a changeless being does not go individual change, and hence should just be seen as one state of affairs, which I agree with. I think Locke's correct in this position. And there goes on to be a bit of a discussion between discrete or dense time and discussion between points and states of affairs, which I will not get into in this video because it goes too far from the current discussion. With that out of the way, let's move on to the seventh principle, which is essentially, since every change is an event which has a beginning, or as something part of a thing that gains or loses property, the first cause must be changeless, and there's not much discussion about here, because he's basically giving quite an analytic definition. And then conclusion 2, since the first cause is initially changeless, it is transcendent, transcendent, and immaterial. And there's also not much difference here. Premise 8 essentially says, in order to cause an event from an initial state, the first cause must have two properties: the capacity to be the originator of the event in a way that it is undetermined by prior events since it's the first cause, and the capacity to prevent itself from undergoing intrinsic or intrinsic change, which is a sense that, well, the first cause must be changes and beginning this because they haven't changed anything within itself. And although there's a slight discussion about the theory of states, I will not raise it here because it's not fully developed and they don't have time to completely discuss it. And then the rest of the debate also is restrained by time, and there's not much discussion about conclusion 3 or conclusion 4, which are this cause has libertarian freedom, and conclusion 4, which has the cause that is uncaused, beginningless, initially changes, transcendent, immaterial, and has libertarian freedom is God. This is kind of what Aquinas likes to say at the end of the thing, saying, well, this cause is what we all know as God. And essentially that is kind of the end of the discussion, though there was a bit more discussion here on the nature or the contrast between a necessary existing universe and a necessary existing God. So I'd like to discuss it a bit here first and then just end the video. So basically what Oppy is trying to say is that a necessary existing universe is more simple, because if all things can trace back to an initial state of necessity, it does appear that the universe is necessary, essentially the same way that I've discussed before, that, well, if God is not necessary, then the universe is necessary, or if the universe is necessary, then God isn't unneeded. So essentially, Oppy is saying, well, let's get rid of an extra ontological entity and commit ourselves to the necessity of the universe. He also says that nothing is unexplained by the universe's necessity. That means that the fact that the universe is necessary explains all possibilities or contingencies or things within the universe. Furthermore, he is not interested in the premises of Locke's, because even if those premises are correct, as long as his view is non-contradictory, it has the best explanatory scope, but by being most simple. And to which Locke, I think, rightfully responds by saying, simplicity is only a consideration if all other things are equal. Locke thinks that, well, given the further evidence we have for the existence of God, like the moral argument or the design argument or the resurrection argument, all of these things seem to point towards the idea that the universe does in fact have a first cause of it and that it's not necessary. So not all things are equal, and hence simplicity should not be the deciding factor. Furthermore, the universe is not past incomplete. Basically, Locke is saying, since the universe has a beginning, going back to the previous discussion about things coming into existence out of nothing, he seems to suggest that, well, since things that come into existence out of nothing need a cause, the universe came into existence out of nothing, therefore the universe has a cause, so it's past incomplete, and past incompleteness points towards the need of a cause. So there follows some further discussion about time and the nature of states of affairs and stuff like that, but that's not really integral to the discussion here. But I hope this summary gives you a, well, for lack of a better word, a good summary or a conclusion or a note-taking kind of idea of the entire debate. If you want to see my notes written out, I would be putting it in my WordPress account, the Apologetics for All blog. If you haven't checked that out, make sure you go check that out. I will have the link for my notes in the description below, so you could go check them out or read through them. And I also have further notes about like different things that I haven't decided to cover over here. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you like this summary, make sure you like and subscribe. It means a lot to me, and it will also help the channel grow. Also, if you haven't checked out Capturing Christianity's channel, make sure you go check it out. He does phenomenal stuff over there on his channel, so I'm sure it will mean a lot to him if you subscribe there as well. Have a great day, stay safe, I hope to see you soon, and God bless. Goodbye.